Welcome, everyone. This is Orange Audubon's third live program of this on our monthly programs in the virtual sphere, and we are still learning, so hopefully no glitches tonight. Hopefully you've been able to find us. I'll have the next slide. I want to tell you that next week at 7 p.m. we are going to have our bird chat. This will be our second one, and we're going to have them weekly, alternating with our monthly programs. And so the next will be August 27th, also September 3rd and 10th, and then ongoing. Next. And bird chat is an hour-long program with just some casual reports on sightings and some quizzes on identification, and finally a planned program, about a half-an-hour program. We've copied a Audubon chapter up north for this format, and we're very excited about it. Next. Oh, by the way, on this one, your registration is required. It'll be on Zoom. So use the Facebook event or email info@orangeaudubonfl.org to get the registration link. Next one. And then our September program will be Cultivating the Wild, William Bartram's Travels, a film by Eric Breitenbach, a professor at Daytona Beach Community College, Daytona State College, with Robert Wilson contributing photography, and Robert will be presenting it. And that one will be similar to this one on YouTube Live. Hope you join us for that one. Next. And we are hard at work on the 2020-2021 brochure, and that should be out in mid-September. And if you are already an Orange Audubon member, you're going to be sent it in the mail. Next. And now to introduce Orange Audubon Society's August speaker, Tyler Beck, Snail Kite Conservation Coordinator for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And I'll just read this real quickly. Tyler grew up in Lake Placid, Florida, where his father was a high school biology teacher. And by the way, he's coming to us right now from Fort Myers. And again, we're very excited about that. He attended biological camps at Archbold Biological Station. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from Florida Gulf Coast University. Afterwards, he did an internship back at Archbold in their Avian Ecology lab, working with Florida scrub jays. And after that, he conducted radio telemetry on great egrets and white ibis throughout the Everglades, and started his master's degree at Florida Atlantic University. His thesis involved characterizing the unique avian communities of the Everglades Stormwater Treatment Areas, STAs. In 2011, Tyler started working for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission doing wetland restoration and bird monitoring in Lake Okeechobee. And for the past 6 years, he's been the Snail Kite Conservation Coordinator for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And so in a second, I'll turn this over to him. And I want to say, post your questions in the comments field of YouTube. You probably need to have a Gmail account to be able to post on YouTube. But if you do, try that, and Tyler will allow questions during the talk. All right. Thank you very much for coming, Tyler, and I turn this over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. I hope everybody can hear me well. And if there are any confusion about my talk, feel free to ask. So for the past, like Deborah said, for the past 6 years, I've been the Snail Kite Conservation Coordinator for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. The reason that we have one dedicated position for this is because as an agency, we manage a great deal of Florida's freshwater wetlands where this endangered bird persists. So it's a full-time job to make sure that while we're stewarding the land and water, trying to take care of it as best we can, we're also both promoting snail kite habitat and breeding, and also doing no harm and working with our state, local, federal, and tribal partners to coordinate those efforts as well. So, like I said, our responsibilities include, I work with our aquatic habitat managers to ensure agency actions support snail kite recovery. I disseminate snail kite nesting information to habitat managers in FWC and other agencies. And we coordinate our actions with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, since they are the governing bodies for endangered species. We maintain a very close relationship with the service. It helps us do the actions that we feel like we need to do to maintain the wetland habitat, while at the same time, just being able to do that work effectively. I also am tasked with developing and securing funding for snail kite research and management contracts. And as a side, I'm also our subject matter expert for the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, since I work so much in the Everglades, and that's the only place where that bird exists. So getting to our subject, the Everglades snail kite. They are a wetland dependent raptor. They're listed as endangered in the precursor to the Endangered Species Act in 1967. They are an extreme dietary specialist. They historically foraged almost exclusively on Florida apple snail, Pomacia pallidosa. They are a subspecies of snail kites that also persist in Cuba, Central, and South America. But they are considered a disjunct and isolated population from those other populations. They are highly mobile, and they can't have the ability to make large-scale movements, and I'll talk some more about that later on in my talk. They require a mix of sparsely vegetated open water for foraging and dense or woody vegetated stands for nesting. Their traditional breeding season goes from roughly March to June, but breeding occurrences outside of that breeding season are common, particularly now, and I'll talk about why that is. And recent population increases in snail kite population can at least partially be attributed to the establishment of the exotic snail Pomacia maculata. So one of the main reasons why they the thought is why they have become endangered is degradation of habitat and loss of habitat. That could be in the form of over-drying of wetlands, or just degradation, eutrophication causing filling into the habitat by dense plants that forbid foraging. So these are just kind of two examples of what would kind of pretty much be considered good snail kite habitat. You got a lot of low stature, not super dense, emergent and possibly submergent vegetation. And then a couple stands, not too big stands, of dense habitat, like cattail or maybe something woody that they could nest in. So a lot of area where they could find their prey, the snails. They can nest in almost anything. Any kind of vegetation. Yeah. These are cattails here, and that is some snail kite nestlings in that nest. Can you guys see my cursor as I move it around the screen? Hopefully. So on the right there is cattails with a snail kite nest in there, and there are nestlings in that nest. They're pretty well hidden when they're in cattails. In the middle is a palm tree, a sable palm. They will nest in these when an area is freshly flooded, because sable palms don't typically grow in flooded habitats, but they will persist once they've established. And then cypress trees, they can also nest in wax myrtles, cocoa plums, really almost anything. Their one main requirement is that their nests are over or surrounded by water, because that helps deter predators from getting to their nests. So hydrology is an important factor in keeping their nesting substrate wet. So that, and there is a nest in this cypress tree here. This up in the top left is a little blown up area of that nest. The guys in the middle work for the University of Florida on the monitoring program. They are checking a nest in that palm tree using a mirror on a pole. So on the left is the historic range of snail kites. The different symbols symbolize documented nesting. The gray area is their primary range. So you can see they've historically nested in quite most of the peninsula of Florida and even some into the panhandle. On the right is eBird recordings of snail kites this is as of today, and this is just for this year. So you can see that they're being seen through much, if not more, of their historic range, but they're not nesting in all of that historic range, at least yet. So the University of Florida is charged with doing the main monitoring of snail kites. They've been doing this since, I think, 1992, yeah. And they use three main methods for this. They conduct a series of surveys, first starting in January, where they go around and try to identify kites and find their nests. When they do find nests, they do nest monitoring. They check back on that nest periodically to see if it has progressed from just a pile of sticks to having some eggs in it to nestlings, and then potentially successful or often a failed nest. And then while they're checking this nest, when the nestlings reach a certain age, they put bands on those nestlings. You can see one of the bands on that right picture. The far right picture is some of the main areas where they survey. Historically, the Everglades were the most productive snail kite nesting area. Okeechobee it has been an important area in recent years, but not particularly the last 2 years. And in recent history, the Kissimmee chain of lakes up there at the top where it says KCOL, the Kissimmee chain of lakes has really been kind of the real stronghold of snail kite nesting as of recently. We've had a fairly bad year this year, but nesting was not bad in the Kissimmee chain of lakes, whereas it was pretty poor elsewhere. So the banding program allows us to really get that good estimate of what the snail kite population is, track their movements when we see banded birds of known age and origin in different locations. And there are lots of different bands. The colors and types of the bands have shifted over the years, or different groups that are banding. You can see some examples here. Most of the bands are like the one on the top right here, this 51P, except for lately they've been putting out blue bands instead of this black band that's shown here. So if anybody was able to take any pictures or spot any banded snail kites, it is a large portion of the population that is banded. If you can get a good picture of the bands or view the bands through a spotting scope and get this letter number combination as well as the color of the band, usually we can tell you where that bird was hatched from and where we've seen it in the recent past. You can send that information on to me, and I usually go through the University of Florida for that. Let's talk a little bit about their main prey. There's the native apple snail, the Homacea pallidosa. Their eggs are white. It's shown on the top there. They are larger eggs. They are pink. They are pinkish when they are first laid, but they later turn white. They lay about 40 to 70 eggs in a clutch. They are not super tolerant to drought or flooding. And the snails themselves have kind of a narrow diet breadth. And what we mean by that is they kind of only eat, it's not that they really just eat the algae that grows on the exterior of plants, of those submerged aquatic plants. The unedited apple snail, or the invasive apple snail, on the other hand, was introduced around Lake Toho near Kissimmee in about 2001. It became the dominant snail species there in about 2004. The snails themselves average larger than the native snails. They have a longer lifespan, and they lay many, many more eggs, even though those eggs are smaller when they are first laid. And the eggs and the snails themselves have a greater drought and flood tolerance. And they can eat a wider variety of vegetation, including the plants themselves. So this is just a little animation. We have some very fortunate information that was gathered by our fisheries folks as they were sampling lakes across Florida. They do this every year. And they started to mark locations where they would see the invasive apple snail egg clusters. And so as they did this, they just did this in what lake they found it throughout a year. And so we've made a little animation of as the eggs are detected in a different wetland across the year. So, oh, wait a minute. Oh. Okay. So you can see at the top, the years go by. The newer lakes that get them are darker red. And you can really see that expansion of those snakes, or those snails out across the state of Florida. And now they've also expanded into Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. So it was really quite an invasion story of these snails. So with these snails came a lot of changes to snail kites. I have to add that snail kites that live in South America, these snails are native to South America, and the snail kites that live in South America readily eat these exotic apple snails, or they're not exotic to them, they're the native apple snails for them. So at first there was fear that our snail kites would not be able to eat them, but because the much larger baseball-sized snails can be very hard to get into and get the meat out of, particularly for juveniles, but they quickly figured out that they don't have to always take the large baseball-sized snails. They can settle for the golf ball or tennis ball-sized snails, something that's easier to get into. And for every really large snail, there's 1,000 medium-sized snails out there. So what this slide shows is just kind of the shift of the snail kite core range. And both the black bars represent the proportion of snail kite nesting that occurs in the Everglades, and the gray bars are the proportion of snail kite nesting that's occurred in the Kissimmee River Valley, or mostly the Kissimmee chain of lakes. And you can see that majority of the nesting through the mid-2000s occurred in the Everglades. But around the time that the snails really took hold in the Kissimmee chain of lakes, that's when nesting really shifted in great numbers to the Kissimmee chain of lakes, and then to Lake Okeechobee and to other areas as well. And it's much more widely distributed across the state now. It's not just where the kites nested has shifted. What this is representing is a couple different areas, and as areas get invaded by these exotic snails, how apparent survival of juveniles, young that have just left the nest or within their first year of leaving the nest, how well they fare. And so this T represents Lake Toho, the first area to get the snails. And you can see their apparent survival. So once these hatch marks show up, these are kind of different eras. So the early area, there were no exotic snails. The middle bar with the hatch marks is with exotic snails, and so on. So you can see that in Toho, apparent survival seemed to go up after invasion of the exotic snails. Same thing for this is the rest of the Kissimmee chain of lakes without Lake Toho. They were later invaded, and you can see once they were invaded, where these bars get these hatch marks, apparent survival really went up after introduction of these exotic snails. Same thing in Okeechobee. But at the time of the publishing of this study, there were not exotic snails in the Everglades or these what we call peripheral marshes. And so their apparent survival never really went up like it did in the other areas that had the snails. A really cool study that came out a couple of years ago out of the University of Florida looked at morphological differences in areas before the exotic snail invasion and afterwards. And what they found that birds are fledging with larger body mass and larger bill lengths after the invasion of exotic apple snails. This is a really busy graph with a lot of stuff going on, but that was the main findings of the study. These are what this is mostly being contributed to is just kind of better abundance of the snails leading to better nutrition and heavier weights. It's not exactly, the birds aren't exactly adapting to these larger snails, but the more abundant food resource these snails provide really allows these birds to grow bigger beaks that will actually then help them get into these bigger snails. And they're fledging at larger body mass. And the larger body mass at fledging is a strong correlate with higher survival. It hasn't been all good for snail kites with these exotic snails. And so the black area on this graph shows what was pretty much the traditional snail kite nesting season. You can see it kind of peaked around March to May, but then really by the midsummer, it was really tailing off. 2011, 2013 was really, we were starting to get nesting a lot later in the year, and including a second kind of bump here in the late summer. And then this was 2015 as an example year where even the early nesting didn't even occur. The majority of the kites didn't even start nesting until the back half of what would have been the traditional nesting season, but it went also much later. And so what's really the effect of this? And there could be a couple, but one that we really saw in 2017 was Hurricane Irma. So the traditional nesting season doesn't really overlap much with the tropical storm activity in Florida. However, post-invasion, the nesting season can really overlap. And that's what we saw with Hurricane Irma. During Hurricane Irma, there were 54 known active snail kite nests, the majority of those being on Lake Okeechobee. And nest checks after Hurricane Irma showed that all 54 of those failed. So there were a good deal, and 2017 was already not really a great year for nesting, so it was kind of a big loss. But fortunately, we see adults seem to survive the storm really well. So each marker here is a bird that had a satellite tag on it. And I need to point out that this data is courtesy of the Avian Research and Conservation Institute. It's a nonprofit that specializes in tracking birds. They do really great work. You can even adopt a bird if you wanted to tag a swallowtail kite and follow it throughout all the way down to South America and back, or maybe you might be able to sponsor a snail kite potentially too. So this is data that they had, and so this is right prior to Hurricane Irma. There was one bird way over here near Loch Session National Wildlife Refuge called 441. There were 3 other birds in the Lehigh Acres, Immokalee area, so that was right before the storm. Pretty much during the storm, 441 almost flew into the storm, but then ended up near Rotenberger Wildlife Management Area as the storm crossed over. And then immediately after the storm, though, it joined all these other 4 birds that were tagged in the Immokalee area. And so, but all 4 of these birds continued to transmit well after the storm, survived the storm just fine. So although we lost a lot of snail kite nesting that year, juveniles or adults seem to survive it pretty well. We think they just hunkered down and rode it out. And you know, the Hurricane Irma really passed almost directly over all 4 of these birds. So it's pretty astounding how well they can handle a big storm like that. One important factor with snail kites that we really look at closely is hydrology, and how changing water levels or holding water levels steady can, or raising water levels up during certain times of the year can really have positive or negative effects on snail kites. So, and that effect is very different across different water bodies, and that's really what this is representing by the different graphs here. The higher the peak of the graph, the more number of snail kite nests are likely to be initiated during that time period. And so places like Okeechobee, really, if their water levels are about 14.5 to 15 is really the peak of when you'll see a lot of kite nesting, but kite nesting really declines below and above that. Lake Toho, majority of the nesting happens right about 55 feet water levels. So it can be important for how many nests we have in a year, given what the water level is. So we try to work with water managers at South Florida Water Management District and Army Corps of Engineers to optimize the snail kite nesting in a lot of these areas.
May I transmit a question? Where or how
Yes.
do they protect themselves during the hurricanes? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so we don't really know. We just think that they hold on for dear life and probably try to grab onto a sturdy tree or something that's going to hold them pretty well and just hold on as well as they can. We've never been out there with them during a hurricane, so we don't really know. So another important factor with water levels is nest survival. Now, I told you before that snail kites always nest over or surrounded by water to protect themselves from predators. But Florida's natural wet and dry season causes water levels to naturally fluctuate. And as basically the snail kite nesting season goes, as spring goes, these wetlands naturally dry out. And also hurricane season, water managers like to release water out of these wetlands to build storage for big rain events like hurricanes and things like that. So we can see that stage can also play a factor in how well nests do at certain water levels. We try to maximize that as well as possible with still working with natural hydrologies of these wetlands. So we saw this kind of really play out in Lake Okeechobee really in 2018 and last year, 2019. You can see on the top right here that these are the water levels as the year went on, and we had very different water levels in that lake between those years. And there, in 2018, there were 189 nests in Lake Okeechobee. We banded 61 birds, they documented 61 birds that were banded and nested in Lake Okeechobee that year. In 2019, because of lower water levels, there was not a single snail kite nest in Lake Okeechobee. But they did recite 51 of those birds elsewhere, but only 10 of those birds were observed nesting, which is a low proportion of adult birds. Usually we think that a good majority of adult birds at least attempt to nest in any given year. Of those birds that did attempt to nest, they had a lower probability of breeding, or I'm sorry, the ones we saw that we observed had a lower probability of breeding. And the ones that did attempt to breed had lower nest success. So we think that this is largely due to having to move to unfamiliar areas to breed, that you don't know exactly where maybe the best places to find food are, or really you're having to find a different bait that you had before or something like that. So there can be longer lasting effects to having a improper hydrology in an area. Of those birds that were recited from Lake Okeechobee, 3 were recited in Lake Okeechobee. Majority of those birds were seen in the Upper St. Johns Marsh. Lake Toho had 6, Lake Kissimmee had 3. So they were kind of seen. One was even seen in Payne's Prairie up by Gainesville. So they were kind of all over looking for places to nest. So this is Lake Toho, just south of Kissimmee and here down to St. Cloud. And this is the current nesting situation that we know of as of the beginning of this month. And every little dot there, it's either green, red, blue, is a known snail kite nest. The green dots are currently active nests. Like I said, these birds are continuing to nest later and later into the year and well into hurricane season. The blue dots are successful nests, and the red dots are nests that did fail. And on the right is just a zoom in area of an area of the lake that we call Big Grassy. Now these circular areas around these nests are another way that we manage for snail kites. Invasive plant management is an important factor in managing for snail kites. A lot of these invasive plants that we have in these water bodies can really take over an area. Particularly water hyacinth can cover the entire surface. And for a snail kite, if you can't get to the water surface where your prey is, then you can't eat. So they can really have a negative effect on snail kites. But at the same time, we do not want to disturb snail kites while they're nesting. And that's what these circles are all about. I send these out regularly. Every time I get new information, new data from the University of Florida, I make new maps like this and send them out to our habitat managers. And the larger circle is basically foraging habitat buffer. We don't alter foraging habitat in that, meaning we don't use herbicides to treat the invasive plants that are going to affect other plants that the birds rely on, or we don't do any big mechanical treatments that's going to affect the foraging habitat. The red circles are what we call disturbance buffer. Those are areas we try not to go into at all while that nest is active. So we really try to avoid actively nesting snail kites as much as we can. And a lot of that depends on us doing a lot of our habitat management in times before snail kites are nesting and getting the habitat in good condition, because we know when snail kites come in and start nesting, then our habitat management has to go very hands off and let the habitat do what it's going to do. So we also try to identify important snail kite nesting areas and rehabilitate those areas if they have been degraded. And a very successful area we've done recently is Lake Okeechobee. One of the things that we noticed on Lake Okeechobee is that the elevation at about 12.5 to 13.5 feet level was disproportionately getting a lot of snail kite nests. They really seem to like to nest in that window of stage or of elevation. But there wasn't a lot of open habitat and good habitat for them in that. But there was historically an area called Moonshine Bay that was really good. And that's over here on the western side of the lake. And even on this little map here, you can see that it was an open bay, but it was no longer an open bay as of a couple years ago. It was completely filled in with cattail. This vegetation map on the right-hand side shows the area. It was historically spike rush, which is the vegetation shown in the top left. And that's shown in the orange on the vegetation map. And so it was just almost all spike rush with little dots of cattail, maybe some water lily or a little bit of willow. And that was this was the information that was collected in 1973. Another survey was done in 1996, and they drew new vegetation maps. And a lot of the area had been filled in by water lily, and the spike rush was starting to go away. And then another survey conducted in 2012, the majority of the area is filled in with cattail. Now, cattail is an important plant for snail kites on Lake Okeechobee and other wetlands because it can be used as nesting substrate, and they can forage amongst it when it's low stature, not too thick. But it can also, under improper water conditions and nutrient conditions, can just completely lock in an area and make it uninhabitable for snail kites. And that's basically what had happened in Moonshine Bay. It went from 8,100 acres of spike rush to 5,500 acres of cattail. So one of our restoration biologists identified this area and said we need to try to restore Moonshine Bay. And so first we herbicided about 3,200 acres of cattail, and then waited a couple months, and then we burned that dead cattail and really opened up that whole habitat. And so you can see kind of the results in the bottom right there, what it looked like afterwards. Much more open, much more available to the snail kites. We also think that this did something with the snail population in there, because we saw a large boom in snails a couple of months afterwards. And you can see here a lot of the snail egg clusters on all this burnt stubble from cattail. The following year is 2016, and Moonshine Bay was the most productive snail kite nesting area in all of South Florida. There were 160 snail kite nests in Moonshine Bay. Lake Okeechobee had its best snail kite nesting year on record. Success rate was much higher in Moonshine Bay than in the rest of the lake. So it was a very successful project. And this area continues to be, there was another good nesting area in 2017, and then a really good nesting area again in 2018. Unfortunately, 2019, 2020 have been too dry for kites to nest in this area. We're currently have just wrapped up another big wetland restoration project on East Lake Toho, much closer to you there in Orange County. See the city of St. Cloud here in the south end, where we did a planned drawdown to mimic natural drought conditions, which is important for these lakes now that we've really started to control their water levels and not let them go dry or not let them get too wet. Their natural hydrology is kind of thrown off a little bit, and it's important for these lakes to every once in a while get a good dry out. It allows the organic material to oxidize, and it allows for germination of a lot of good plants out there that won't happen under completely watered situations. So we dewatered East Lake Toho last year, and then we got heavy equipment out, and we bulldozed a lot of the vegetation and organic material that had built up from not drying out in a long time along the east side, and then on the north and west shores we herbicided a lot of the cattail and burned it. They will come back pretty quickly, but it just allows us to open up that habitat and allow for some different vegetation to grow in there as well. So we'll see, hopefully as early as next year, we'll see some good results from that. It wasn't just a snail kite project, but I think the snail kites will benefit greatly from that project. That lake has since refilled and is now back to its normal water levels as of a couple weeks ago.
Tyler, can we get in a couple questions?
Sure.
And I'm going to put them, do you see them? Do you see the question?
I cannot see the questions now.
Okay. So the question was, are snails at the water surface?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. I should have talked about this earlier. So both species of snails have kind of primitive lungs, and they have poor gills. So every once in a while they can come up to the surface and breathe air when the oxygen level gets kind of low. So snail kite can either capture the snail in very shallow water, or these snails are often up near the surface of the vegetation, near the surface of the water, that allows the snail kites to capture them.
Okay. And then several people asked if there were any adverse consequences of introducing the new apple snails. And if you want to address that later, if you're coming to that, that'll be fine.
So I talked a little bit about, I can address that now. I talked a little bit about now their nesting season overlaps more with hurricane season, and we saw that in 2017 with Hurricane Irma. There are also studies, the University of Florida has shown that the later a bird fledges in a year, so these later nests, birds are fledging now often in August, September, October, sometimes in November. The later a bird fledges in the year, the less chance it has of surviving its first year. And even if it does survive past its first year, it has poor survival even after that. And what we think is kind of going on there is that probably the foraging conditions are really best, and the hydrologic conditions are best towards the end of the dry season and the early wet season. And so if you're a bird and you fledge into the best conditions you can, you kind of have the best shot to figure yourself out, figure out how you're going to get food, where you're going to go, and those kinds of things. But probably the hardest time to be a snail kite is in the fall and early winter. And so if you're a very naive bird just coming off the nest and not knowing how to make your way in the world, and you're coming out into the hardest situation you can, it's going to be much harder for you to survive. So that is potentially another drawback of these exotic snails. There's also some evidence, we're working to look more into this, that these exotic snails are having a negative impact on a lot of the beneficial vegetation in these lakes. Like I said, they actually eat the plants themselves and not just the algae that grows on the exterior of the plant. So they have the potential to really change the vegetative structure out there. We know if you put them in a tank with different kinds of vegetation, there's almost nothing they won't eat. And they can really do some damage to some of the natural grasses and stuff that are growing in these lakes, like we call it Kissimmee grass or Paspaldium. There's a lot of people that think that the disappearance of a lot of these native grasses on these lakes is at least partially due to these exotic apple snails. So that is another potentially real negative impact to not just aquatic habitat, but these are also the vegetation that snail kites traditionally foraged in to find those snails. So if there's no more of that vegetation, that low stature, short grasses for them to find these snails, and they're just in the cattails and the thicker stuff, they can't find them, and that could be a problem for snail kites.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll let you go on.
So one of the things that we did with this East Lake Toho project, we're doing two things. So we want to really take a good look at examining what the effects of doing a project like this is on both snails and snail kites. So we have an internal group that's been monitoring snails with the East Toho drawdown. We have people that actually dive in the lake and count the snails as they swim transects. We put radio transmitters on snails and track their movement as the lake was drying down. We're still waiting to get the results of those studies back. Another study that we're doing right now is we're putting these little satellite / cellular receivers on the snail kites. So we take the juveniles just before they can fly. They're probably within a couple of days of being able to fly, and taking them out of the nest and strapping them with this little backpack transmitter thing. And this backpack transmitter is a GPS unit that records its location 12 times a day, and then it uploads that information through our cell phone networks, and then I can download that data off of a website called MoveBank. And so this is giving us real detailed information about how these juveniles are moving shortly after they leave the nest, and how some of the perils that they're coming into with survival. One of the concerns with the East Lake Toho project was that we were going to have some nests on the lake earlier in the year, and then those birds were still going to be kind of reliant on the lake when we started drying it out. And we worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, and they said, you know, we still want to approve the drawdown of East Lake Toho because we think it's overall going to be a net benefit, but can you track to see what happens to the juvenile snail kites there as you dry it down? Well, it turns out that we didn't really have any snail kites that any success. We had one successful snail kite nest the year before that when we were concerned, and it fledged well before we drew down the lake. So it really wasn't a concern for that, but we're still getting a lot of good information from the movement of these birds, and I'll show you some of that. So this person on the bottom left is Caroline Poley. She's a recent PhD graduate from the University of Florida, and this was her project. And let me hope to display. So you can see a couple icons. There's a purple one for a bird that we tagged on East Lake Toho, and then there are two here. One's red and one's, I think, yellow. And so these represent the birds and their movements. And if this animation works, you will see these eventually start to move around the landscape. So this red bird, as soon as it left, it went down the Kissimmee River. The Kissimmee River was particularly good at this time. So you'll see actually all three of these birds spend a good portion of their time along the Kissimmee River. So this is July by now. This bird goes over a lake called Lake Pierce. And that lake we had no idea that snail kites were using at all. I asked our invasive plant managers about snail kite use of that lake, and they said their snail kites never use that lake. And I said, well, there's at least one using it now. When you see those big sweeping movements like that, that's one big movement because it's multiple locations in one day. So they kind of start finding their way around the world by doing these big looping movements, and then they usually end up back where they are if they don't find a good area. Okay, so now we're into August, and you'll see kind of more big sweeping movements, but mostly they're really liking along the Kissimmee River. There was a lot of flow on the Kissimmee River at this time. We were shedding a lot of water from a particularly wet spring. Okay, we're into September now. There was a big sweep movement, and it found a place up in the upper St. John's, probably around Three Forks water management area. This bird's still hanging out in the Kissimmee River. By the way, all three of these birds, so this was in 2018 that these birds were tagged, and all this motion is from 2018. But all three of these birds are still alive. And we're still tracking them, at least as of a couple days ago. And this yellow bird that moved over to Lake Pierce that we didn't know snail kites used is actually there right now. One of the birds is down kind of in this location here where you just saw one. Look, one of the birds moved all the way down to the Everglades and spent some time down in, looks like the Miccosukee Reservation. And then another bird is somewhere around State Road 60, just west of Vero Beach. And it's been there pretty much for months. You can see they can really move around a lot. And these are very young birds. They're just, at this point, they're 5-6 months old. But they really survey the landscape and find different areas and what's the best area for them to be. And so so on the left here is what the movements that you just saw from those three different birds, where all they went in that 6 months or so that we showed you. And on the right here is those, as of today, where the last locations for those birds, most of these are the locations as of today. And so, yeah, that yellow bird is on Lake Pierce. This one's down in the Kissimmee River floodplain, and this one's up in the upper St. John's. So you can really see, they really can cover a lot of ground and survey a lot of the state. And this is integral to their ability to find new areas, to move areas when conditions aren't very good in the area that they're used to. They know other areas that they can flee to and find food resources. And so we've tagged 30-something birds in the life of this project. And so this is a movement of all the birds that we've tagged. This one here was just a couple of weeks ago. This bird left Payne's Prairie up near Gainesville, and circled around Macon, Georgia, came back down, and we ended up just east of Orlando. I can't remember the wetland that it ended up in. Unfortunately, all this movement was pretty much just straight movement. It never really was able to stop and forage. Didn't really find any food along the way, and it was found sitting on a seawall on a lake just east of Orlando, and it was taken to a wildlife rehab where it was very emaciated and unfortunately didn't survive. But that's probably a consequence of ending up in Georgia and not South Florida or somewhere with better conditions. Ignore these purple lines over on the east. There was a glitch on one of those transmitters, and for some reason it had a couple locations off the coast of Africa. So that's not real. So what are the threats to snail kite nesting? A camera study was done in 2010 and 2011. And on the right here, you can see this is a game camera positioned over a snail kite nest. We're kind of redoing the study, looking more into this stuff. But this really told us what the causes of nest failure are. And of all the 92 nests that were monitored in 2010, 2011, majority, or at least half of those, roughly half of those fledged, which is a very high proportion. So these were successful nests. But the number one cause of nest failure was predation. We thought there was a lot of nest collapse. But it turns out nest predation was really the number one cause. Some nests get abandoned, maybe if food resources dry up or something like that. And so when we look closer at what the predators are, yellow rat snake was the main predator that we saw, but also it could be almost anything. It could be alligators getting in the nests, marsh rice rats, raccoons, a cottonmouth, great horned owl. We even had a purple gallinule get in and take the eggs out of one nest. So that was very surprising. So it could be just about anything. And this is why it's very important to have a nest that's surrounded by water. They already have a lot of these aquatic predators that can get to them. But being surrounded by water will protect you somewhat from raccoons and yellow rat snakes and things like that. And so here's just some of the pictures that were from that study. You can see the raccoon in the top left and the marsh rice rat on the right, and then the alligator in the bottom left. So nesting this year's, it's been focused in just a couple areas, really. The first area I'm going to talk about is Paynes Prairie. Now, this is an area, it's just City of Gainesville is here at the top, near the top of this picture. It's an area that we've never known them to nest up until about 2.5 years ago, when kites started showing up there and started nesting. This is a treatment wetland called Sweetwater. They've been showing up there for a little while, and we think that snails got in there first and then spread out throughout the whole prairie. The other thing that happened is with Hurricane Irma, all the rain and wind clogged the sink that normally drained Paynes Prairie. So it's holding a lot more water than it ever has before. It used to be much more of a prairie, and now it's more of a marsh. But that tends to change. So each one of these dots is a kite nest from this year, and a couple of them are still active. But we haven't had any kite nesting north of East Lake Toho in decades that we know of. And then all of a sudden they show up, over 100 miles away from where they had been nesting, and just start nesting in big numbers. Last year was a very good year for them in Paynes Prairie. The other core area from this year was the Kissimmee chain of lakes. So we have usually East Lake Toho, but we had it drawn down this year. West Lake Toho, Lake Kissimmee. We also have some nesting going on right now at Lake Jackson, Lake Marion, and Tiger Lake. And then the other area that's a new area is down here in Palm Beach County. It's an area that's managed by Palm Beach County called Loxahatchee Slough. It's a wildlife management area or a recreational area. But they've been doing a lot of hydrologic restoration and invasive plant removal, and it really seems to be paying off, because before this year we have 0 documented nests in this area in recent history. And right now there are, I think, 46 nests active in there right now. So it's really a hot area for snail kites right now. But what we haven't had is any snail kite nesting in Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, or the upper St. John's marshes. And those are all 3 core traditional snail kite nesting areas. And it was a particularly dry year in a lot of these areas, and that is probably playing a big role in why we haven't seen nesting in those areas this year. This is just a breakdown of where kite nesting was this year, concentrated in the Kissimmee chain of lakes, and then this other encompasses the Loxahatchee Slough and Payne's Prairie because they're not classified in any of these other traditional nesting areas. But you can see in other areas like Lake Okeechobee has been, one of the best nesting areas in the state, if not the best, for 2016 and 2018. Kissimmee chain of lakes is more steady throughout the year, even though this year, compared to a lot of years, it wasn't that great. We're happy to get the nesting that we did in the Kissimmee chain of lakes. Everglades should be the snail kite stronghold, and hopefully once we get the hydrology right in the Everglades, they will return there very strongly. And this is just all those areas kind of summarized. You can see where we are as far as kite nesting so far in 2020. But the year's not done. We may still get a couple more nests, and we may at least reach the levels that we were at in 2017. 2017 was another very dry year. So how's the kite population doing overall? University of Florida, with all their banding and monitoring work, they come out with a population estimate every year, and their estimates have gotten better and better throughout the year. You can see that when they first started putting population estimates out, they had very wide confidence intervals. It's because we didn't have a whole lot of birds that were banded out there to make this estimate with. And what else you can see in here is around year 2000, 2001, the state went into a very severe drought, and the snail kite population got cut in half. And so, but then it kind of hovered around the 1,300 bird level for a while. And then we had another severe drought in 2007, and the snail kite population halved again. So we were down to about 700, 800 birds in 2009. But since then, we've really made a pretty steady climb back up. And we had a good population estimate for 2019. That was 3,115 birds. So it was a good jump from 2018, the year before. And next year they'll start they're going to start crunching the numbers for 2020. I think we might actually see a little bit of a decline because we've had two years of reduced nesting compared to what we saw in 2016 and 2018. But I don't think it'll be a huge decline. And so that's all the information I have for you, other than answering any questions you still have.
Okay. I just had one quick one. Were you aware of a nesting pair at Newton Park on Lake Apopka?
No, I was not. We've kind of thought about Lake Apopka. It gets a couple of snail kites there periodically, but it's not regularly surveyed because it doesn't get very heavy kite use. So no, I was not aware that there was. We know that there's some nesting that occurs out there that doesn't get found by the monitoring crew, but it's a small portion, and apparently Lake Apopka this year was an area for that. If anybody does know of any known nesting that's not in one of these main nesting lakes, feel free to reach out to me and let me know, and I can investigate or send the University of Florida crew to investigate.
That's great. Yes, I think photographers are finding these places, and so everybody get his email address. I think there was one other question that wasn't answered, and it has to do with are there any other predators of the invasive snails?
Well, yeah. So limpkins are the other thing that mainly eats snails in Florida, and they are seeing a population boom and a range expansion. They're starting to see limpkins well throughout Georgia. I think maybe they were just documented breeding in South Carolina, and then into Alabama and Louisiana, and that's a major range expansion. And that's mostly due to the expansion of these invasive snails. A professor at Florida Atlantic University documented that crayfish really prefer dining on the juvenile, the very small invasive snail eggs, or not eggs, but the very small, freshly hatched invasive snails. More so than the natives, because the natives, I think, hatch out with at least some of a tough shell on them. But the exotics are very small when they're hatched and probably just can be readily consumed by crayfish. I'm sure alligators will eat them, especially smaller sized alligators, and really anything else that would eat the native snail will probably eat the exotic snail.
Okay, we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, and I'd like to say to everyone, I'd like to say to you, Tyler, thank you so much. It was really excellent presentation, and we mastered the technology, didn't we? We did it.
Good, I'm glad it worked out.
And everybody, will see you on Bird Chat on August 27th, and I wish you all a great evening. And you too, Tyler.
Okay.
Do again.
All right, feel free to email me questions too if you think of anything later. I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, have a good evening.
You too.